The next important question for the students in this particular series is of questions. Discuss the narrative structure in Huckleberry Finn. The narrative structure in Huckleberry Finn, the book Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, features an episodic structure in terms of its narrative structure. There are three components that may be split into. First person narration is used throughout the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which is continued on by the protagonist Huck Finn. This gives the work the feel of an autobiography, with Huck narrating his individual and social identity throughout the novel. The narrative becomes more serious and believable, and owing to the unavailability of commentary, Mark Twain was able to easily portray the most heinous facts of modern social life because he used first person narrative in his writing. Nevertheless, Tom is eliminated from the story in chapter 3, and with him, the romantic aspect in the shape of his effort to organize a gang of thieves is also lost from the story. With the introduction of Pap Finn, Huck's alcoholic father, the story takes a dramatic turn in chapter 4. Huck, who can't tolerate the widow Douglas and her sister Miss Watson, effort to civilize him, can't stand the unsettling presence of his father even more. He flees to Jackson Island after taking his own death in the cottages where his father had imprisoned him. And when Miss Watson, so we find that when Miss Watson's slave Jim finds out about Miss Watson's intention to sell him across the river for $100, he flees to the island as well. Huck and Jim reunite on the island, and Huck swears Jim that he will never betray him again. Hearing that Jim is being pursued, Jim and a friend decide to flee together down the Mississippi River on a raft in a search of safety. The 11 chapters that follow provide the foundation for the tale of Huck and Jim's epic escape. The following 20 chapters, chapter 12 to 31, form the heart of the novel, detailing Huck and Jim's trip down the Mississippi, initially on their own and then in the company of the two con artists, the king and the duke. The trip is interrupted many times by events on the beach, in which the two friends, frauds, have a role in a number of them, not friends but frauds. In an attempt to study the narrative structure of the adventure of the Huckleberry Finn, we can divide it into three broad sentences. Sections. Though there is no clear demarcation between these sections, we can outline them fairly well. The first section begins with the introduction of Huck's life with society and his reactions to the civilizing efforts of the people around him. We learn of the difference between the approach of Huck and that of his friend, Tom Sawyer. Huck does not accept the constricting environment offered by this society, and is always in a quest to break free. This section ends shortly after the reappearance of his father, Pap. Pap treats Huck with a lot of cruelty, and this triggers off the latter's resolve to run away. He takes his own murder and makes his escape. Section 2 is also about Huck's journey down the river Mississippi with Miss Watson's runaway slave. This section can further be divided into various episodes. Each episode is the story of Huck and Jim's encounter with different people and situations and their sustained efforts of survival. It is in this section that we get a pleasant view of the river and of life on the raft. Simultaneously, we have a rendezvous with various characters who embody the intrinsic basis of human nature. This is also the section that helps us truly appreciate why Huck finds society so constricting and his reason for shunning it. The third section begins from the end of the chapter 31 with Huck's return to civilization. This return is not sought by him. It happens when the king and the duke sell Jim to the Phelps, Phelpses. This section ends with Huck's renewed attempts to escape from society with his announcement that he would light out for the territory. Amongst the Injuns, INJUNS, he says, "But I reckon I got to light out for the territory ahead of the rest. Because Aunt Sally, she's going to adopt me and civilize me, and I can't stand it. I've been there before." Talking of symmetry, there is another symmetrical characteristics of the novel. Tragedy and serious episodes alternate with humor and comedy. Huck and Jim, the Walter Scott, Huck and Jim rendezvous with the two thieves on board the Walter Scott alternates with the amusing account of the story of Solomon and his actions. The Boggs episode, BOGGSEPISODE, is another instance where the comic as well as tragic intermingle. The entry of Boggs is a comic one. People of the lazy town seem to derive pleasure from the useless and frivolous pursuits like dog fights, setting dogs, tails afire, and the comedy associated with Boggs, swearing and threats. Such pursuits seem to provide them with a much needed distraction from the mundane, everyday life. All the loafers looked glad. I reckon they were used to having fun out of Boggs. With the killing of Boggs comes a comparatively serious suggestion. Yet people aren't really moved. They are rather they would rather derive pleasure from it than sympathize with Boggs' daughter. This scene ends with Colonel Sherburne's speech on what he thinks is the true worth of man and his so called bravery. Now, his so called bravery. Therefore, comedy culminates into tragedy and vice versa. Now, what is the point of view? The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is written in the first person point of view, which allows the reader to experience the story through Huck's eyes and identify closely with the narrator. The story is told entirely from Huck's perspective, and Huck refers to himself as I throughout the novel. Readers experience both external events and Huck's internal thoughts and feelings from his vantage point. Even so, we see that even when Huck is being deceitful, as when he dresses as a girl and lies to the woman he meets in order to get information about his father, Huck's actions remain unsympathetic because the reader knows his motivations. In one sense, many of the Huck's actions are not that different from the king and the Jew. All three tell stories to manipulate people, but because we know Huck's motives are altruistic, his actions seem justified. Don't see the story from the perspective of the king and the duke, so we can only assume they are selfish and greedy as the actions suggest. It is necessary for the reader to relate closely to Huck so that the moral stakes of his dilemma about helping Jim are high. So, these points are to be noted before we narrate to Jim and the type that it wants to be are high, and the reader is fully invested in Huck's decision. Style, aside from the notice and explanatory sections, Huckleberry Finn is written entirely in the vernacular of the characters, which makes the story intimate and casual, but also requires Careful reading. Huck, as the book's narrator, speaks in a friendly, naive, and uneducated style, often using slang and incorrect grammar such as no for any. At the same time, his detailed knowledge of the river and his extended poetic description of nature are sophisticated and informed, expanding the scope of reader's view. Huck also frequently reminds the reader that he is telling a story beginning with a reference to the book's author as Mr. Mark Twain, who told the truth mainly, and concluding with the sign of yours truly, Huck Finn. At times he cuts his narrative short, as after he sees the Granger Forbes killed. I ain't aging to tell all that happened, again directing the reader's attention to the fact he's telling a story. Twain also references many novels and the conventions of genres or genres, such as romances, reminding the reader that the work is a literary creation and part of a larger tradition of storytelling. Huck's casual style of speaking to the reader proves engaging and inclusive, including a sense of intimacy and trustworthiness, in contrast to the many deceitful adult characters he encounters. From the novel very first sentence, Huck addresses readers, directly inviting them into his tale whether or not they are they have read the prequel. You don't know about me without you have a read book by the name The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. So this book has been read by nearly every child. It is supposed to be so. This book, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, is very interesting. If the students get the opportunity to read the book, they must not miss the opportunity because it is very interesting and will make you really worthy of reading such a book. So I would suggest students to read this book. It is very, very useful. Now, after this, Huck's casual style of speaking to the reader proves engaging and inclusive, creating a sense of intimacy and trustworthiness in contrast to the many deceitful adult characters he encounters. From the novel very first sentence, Huck addresses readers directly, inviting them into his tale. And we also get involved into it. This intimacy and trustworthiness becomes even more important when Huck, and by extension, the reader must choose between the laws of society and his own moral judgment. The tone of Huckleberry Finn is also moralistic, most clearly on the theme of slavery. Over the course of the novel, Huck asks questions and confronts moral dilemmas that enable him to see the basic injustice of slavery, if only as it pertains to Jim. Although Huck never explicitly realizes that the larger institution of slavery is morally deplorable, the novel on a whole functions as a moral argument for emancipation. Early on, Huck tries to explain to Jim why some people speak French. Jim insists that all men are essentially the same, asking if a Frenchman is a man. Dad blame it. Why don't he talk like a man? Jim's insistence on the equality of all men can be extended to an argument against slavery. As all men are created equal, the tone of questioning is sustained throughout the novel, as Huck is forced to confront his basic assumptions about humanity, not only in terms of slavery, but also about class. The King and the Duke satirizes the idea of nobility and about what it means to be a truly civilized human being. Now, No, the most important aspect is the conclusion we draw from it. We know that this work of Mark Twain was not a sustained piece. There was a gap of a good 3 years before the work was published. Some critics feel that the work has been cracked on to get Twain finish the novel and have it published. And from the monetary point of view, but but this but in the light of the above argument, this does not seem to be a cogent rationally. So all the important aspects of the novel has been dealt with in this answer for the students, making them prepared for the examination part of it. I request the students to study them carefully and they'll be able to answer it. This much faith I have in them. Thank you.